Hello everybody, and welcome back once again to Gazagoju YT, and today we are back with the third and final episode of Imperatyrannus sanguinis versus the most powerful theropod hybrids in the Great Hybrid War. Now I'll explain why this is the last episode after a bit, but now let's move on to the fun stuff. Starting off, we have the appropriately named Starter Rex, a random YouTuber's attempt at making an Indam 2.0 that outclasses that of Goji centers by relying on the classic evolutionary traits of regular theropods. And while it certainly excels in that task, that still doesn't help him quite a lot against my hybrid Viggo, as while he may be faster and more agile, against a much larger and more robust hybrid with much greater reach courtesy of that rather flexible tail and powerful forelimbs, this makes it to where the Astarter Rex would not have the sufficient mass to deal enough damage to my hybrid as he proceeds to get overpowered and knocked down to the ground before getting finished off with a powerful bite to the neck or a devastating arm swipe. Up next, we have Jaws, that one Paraceratherium's attempt at making a bio-accurate version of one of Monster Hunter's most iconic beasts. Now, you might recall the rivalry that happened between this theropod hybrid and another theropod hybrid by the name of Cronus, who himself was featured on this series. However, while Jaws did end up getting the win after noting a few critical weaknesses in Cronus' design, which do end up affecting Viggo in some way, shape, or form, don't worry, I'll address that in a little bit. Another thing that's worth mentioning is that Jaws herself doesn't escape from the punishment just yet, as after all those jaws are still a pretty huge mess, namely the multiple rows of teeth that come at the cost of lips. Now, that one Paraceratherium tried to debunk this by saying that Jaws regenerated its teeth in a similar manner to T-Rex, with the tiger shark additive also influencing this trait to a minor degree, not realizing that this was an absolute recipe for disaster, as out of the three genetic contributors that contributed to the teeth, those being T-Rex, Purosaurus, and tiger shark, T-Rex arguably regenerated its teeth the slowest, which is why it is the only one out of the three that had lips to keep its teeth well protected, besides the fact that it is the only terrestrial animal out of the bunch. And tiger shark simply adds fuel to the fire, as the way sharks regenerate their teeth is completely incompatible with the way that vertebrates like T-Rex regenerate their teeth, no matter how minuscule its effect may be on Jaws, which, when combined with the lack of lips, make it to where its teeth would be absolutely useless, leaving Jaws deprived of its primary weapon against Viggo, which would mean it would be absolutely curb stomped. The next opponent Viggo will have to go up against is Raphael, which quite frankly is just a replica of Minos, who appeared on the first episode of this series, so in case you remember how that fight went, then you know how this one will go. Next up is arguably the most bizarre theropod hybrid to ever be mentioned on this series, and you can probably tell that by its name alone. Meet Diddy Prime. No, I am not joking, that's actually its name. And this 13 metric ton theropod hybrid is not to be underestimated with, as its completely bizarre and peculiar genome in comparison to many other theropod hybrids mentioned on this series grants him some very nasty armaments in the form of large hooked claws and a powerful bite with large tusks in order to implement the maximum piercing power in order to pierce right through my hybrid's defenses with ease. Couple that with its surprising speed, agility, and stamina, all while being more structurally stable in comparison to other theropod hybrids mentioned in this series. This guy can potentially beat my hybrid through death by 1,000 cuts. However, the moment Viggo is able to land a single hit on him, it's arguably game over, as this fight in that scenario would turn into a brawl in which my hybrid with his much larger size and more robust / more stable frame, given that he's a bit more quadrupedal, would allow him to quite easily overpower the Prime and penetrate through his rather moderate defenses in comparison to other theropod hybrids mentioned throughout this series, granting Viggo a hard-fought victory. For our next two challengers, we have two theropod hybrids that made it to the final 16 of the Great Hybrid War 1.1, starting off with Nero 2.0, arguably one of the best Spinosaurid hybrids to be ever made. Now, in case you watched the Great Hybrid War 1.1, you might recall when Nero 2.0 went up against another hybrid by the name of Demoroshi, who, despite not being a theropod himself, does share a decent number of similarities with my hybrid Viggo. And you might recall how Nero 2.0 won that fight, courtesy of his superior speed and agility that allowed him to capitalize on Demoroshi's poor mobility, range of motion, and reach, in addition to being large and strong enough to back up its armaments and armor in order to allow him to tank and deal enough damage to eventually beat Demoroshi. However, this is where arguably the two major differences between Viggo and Demoroshi come into play. As while Viggo may not be as tanky as Demoroshi, he does have a much better range of motion as well as a much greater reach, which would allow him to react better to Nero 2.0 and land more hits much more easily. And with his immense power and how deadly those weapons are, he would most likely be able to deal severe damage before Nero 2.0 can deal any significant damage of his own. So after a brutal fight, where Nero 2.0 would still be able to land a couple of gnarly hits that would severely injure my hybrid, I'd say that courtesy of his superior mass and sheer strength, Viggo 2.0 would barely be able to come out on top. The second theropod hybrid coming back from my Great Hybrid War 1.1's Final 16 is Ferox Rex Secundus, who is to King what Raphael is to Minos, but better, as this guy, just like the original King from the first episode of this series, would give my hybrid the fight of his life, courtesy of his rather large size, immense athleticism, and powerful equipment that would give Viggo a run for his money. And this guy could definitely win in a good number of scenarios. But I do think that for the most part, Viggo's immense physical strength and still much larger size in comparison to the 16-ton Ferox Rex in this scenario, whereas my hybrid is 20 tons, would make it to where he would be able to just barely overpower Ferox Rex and eventually pull off a hard-fought victory. Arguably one of, if not the most difficult fight as of now. Now it's time for the final boss. This will be the last hybrid my hybrid Viggo will ever go up against. And this one is rather unique considering that it is the only hybrid that will be ever coming back from a previous episode, namely the first episode. And this guy is also the only theropod hybrid who has managed to beat Viggo thus far. And so, as you could have guessed, especially with how much Viggo has been struggling so far with many of the theropod hybrids he has faced throughout this series, if he wishes to overcome this last challenge, he's gonna need a couple of upgrades, which is exactly what I'm gonna do now, as I'm about to reveal some upgrades that I've had for this guy for quite some time now, and it's about time that they start to kick in as they push him to fulfill his final task ever. First off, let's start with the genetic contributors that are being removed from Viggo 2.0's genome, those being Postosuchus, Diplodocus, Staganolepis, Regal Horned Lizard, Common Swift, and Red Kangaroo. Postosuchus, Diplodocus, and Common Swift were removed due to better alternatives being found. Regal Horned Lizard and Red Kangaroo were removed due to the fact that their contributions do not function as well at the scale that Viggo 2.0 is in. And lastly, Staganolepis was removed due to its contribution now being redundant. As for the new additions to my hybrid's genome, the first one is Albertosaurus sarcophagus. This medium-sized tyrannosaur will provide its ampulla, a specialized void in the teeth that helps with a more even distribution of pressure around them, increasing tooth durability when biting through armor and bones. The second new addition is Supersaurus viviani, which provides all of the same contributions that Diplodocus provided but more suitable at a larger scale. The third addition is Brontomerus macintoschi. This buff sauropod will give my hybrid a stronger and wider core body in addition to a more muscular tail base, and most importantly, its hip and hind limb structures for granting my hybrid's legs a wider range of motion for kicks and longer strides, translating to a greater overall speed. The fourth addition is Ledomahadi Mafube, which will provide its pelvic structure for a decent transition between quadrupedal and bipedal stances, in addition to its more robust forelimbs as the base structure for my hybrid, making them more suitable for weight support all while still being able to deal significant damage. The fifth addition is Utatus pasquale. This extinct armadillo will boost my hybrid's forelimbs to a mild degree, allowing for much larger muscle attachment points and adding more robusticity to some arm bones for better weight support and more forceful arm swipes without sacrificing range of motion when striking. The sixth addition is Xenosmiles venezuelanensis, which will provide modifications to the fatty pads on my hybrid's feet and hands, allowing for better cushioning when walking on the floor, for not only better weight support but also muffling the sounds of its footsteps when walking even further, not to mention granting my hybrid semi-retractable claws. Not too much to where it would be awkward for Viggo to walk when he's on all fours, but just enough to keep his claws intact. The seventh addition is the giant anteater, which will provide the actual claws in the form of three large sickle-like claws, which are highly optimal for piercing deep through thick layers of muscle and armor, in addition to wider ribs for an extra layer of defense as well as greater stability, not to mention its sticky saliva for optimal venom delivery instead of the common swift. The eighth addition is the Peregrine Falcon, which will make up for the second trait that the Common Swift provided in the form of faster neural processing speeds. Now, these won't be to the same degree as the Peregrine Falcons in order to minimize my hybrid's metabolic rates, but still enough to allow him to keep up with smaller theropods a bit more easily, not to mention his sense of balance, which will allow my hybrid to maintain his stability during combat. The ninth addition is the Big-Headed Turtle, which will provide its bony plates on the face for optimal facial protection. The 10th addition is the leatherback sea turtle. This car-sized marine reptile will help further boost my hybrid's immune system, making it even more resistant to a wider range of toxins and diseases, in addition to a substantial boost in stamina, courtesy of its lactic acid buffering agents, its heightened amounts of hemoglobin and myoglobin, which will be reduced substantially in the case of my hybrid to prevent any major health issues, but still enough to give it a minor boost in stamina, as well as increased blood volume relative to body size, as well as greater control of its blood vessels in order to allow blood to flow properly, not to mention its thick, smooth, and rubbery skin for acting as a first layer of defense as well as maintaining the dermal set of armor in good condition. The last addition is the Congo Bashir. This living fossil provides its flexible, diamond-shaped gonoid scales, which will be situated at the dermal skin layer underneath of the sea turtle skin, especially that these scales are dermal bony structures that, while not directly connected, are tightly packed and serve a defensive function, just like the osteoderms embedded in the sea turtle's dermis, with the Bashir scales basically combining the best traits of Arapaima scales and alligator gar scales into one, in addition to extra blood vessels for better transfer of oxygen to the organs, as well as a valve to close off the windpipe to prevent unwanted substances from making their way through. Now that we're over with the upgrades, it's time to finally introduce the 2.0 version of my most powerful theropod hybrid. Sanguinityrannus colossus, name meaning the colossal blood tyrant, codenamed Viggo as you could have guessed. Height, 6.1 meters or 20 feet in its quadrupedal stance, 6.7 meters or 22 feet in its bipedal stance, and 10 feet or 32.8 feet in its tripod stance. Length, 23.5 meters or 77 feet, and weight, 25 tons. Now onto the final boss fight. Now you might recall in the first episode of Imperatyrannus Sanguinis versus the most powerful theropod hybrids in the Great Hybrid War that Spinosuchus was the final boss that Viggo had to go up against. But you might also recall that he went up against a female Spinosuchus, which made the fight a lot more fair and granted Viggo a slight victory. But against a male Spinosuchus, Viggo got absolutely demolished, even though he still would have lost to many of the theropod hybrids on a good number of occasions, but that's besides the point. Now with these upgrades, Viggo comes back for round 2 against the male Spinosuchus, and while his opponent still retains a comfortable size advantage, Viggo is not only bigger and stronger than his previous counterpart, but also still holds a speed and agility edge over Spinosuchus, with much better armor and weapons to deal far more significant damage, as well as having the superior speed and agility to land more hits, all while his armor allows him to tank a good bit of damage from those bites and claws that Spinosuchus boasts. And overall, while this is going to be a very lengthy fight given how much of a tank Spinosuchus is and how still hard-hitting he would be, I'd say that Viggo now would stand a much better chance against this beast and would be able to eventually take him down courtesy of his much better equipment as well as being the perfect blend of strength and speed just enough in order to take down this Goliath and reclaim the title of the most powerful theropod hybrid, at least for now. And that now doesn't really say much, as Viggo now declares his retirement from holding the most powerful theropod hybrid in the Great Hybrid War title. And that comes down to many reasons, but arguably the main reason is the backlash. Now, in case you are exclusively a YouTube hybrid community member, then you might have not heard of this. But after the first 2 episodes of this series, my hybrid Viggo was met with a lot, and I mean a lot, of backlash, with the creators of these 2 hybrids in front of you, Apophis and Shredder 3.0, being only 2 amongst many who complained about the judging of these contests, or should I say these fights, claiming that these fights were heavily rigged and biased, considering that my hybrid Viggo wasn't really all that. And while I do find the arguments that they threw at me rather iffy, after looking a bit more deeply into it, I do realize that Viggo was certainly not the best theropod hybrid out there. And while he definitely isn't as unfunctional as some people may claim, he's definitely far from being the strongest. And with that, I admit that I may have gone a bit too far, and so I've decided to put an end to this series once and for all. So yeah, to all the hybrid creators whose hybrids were pitted up against my hybrid, Viggo is now officially retired and you'll never see or hear anything from him ever again. I hope this makes you happy. And with that, we conclude this video as well as this series. Thank you everybody so much for watching. I hope you really enjoyed this video, even though I probably bet that for the most part you didn't. And be sure to tune in next time for a bit of a more delightful surprise. I hope, at least. So until then, goodbye.